Success isn't just about what you achieve. It's about living a life that reflects your values and priorities. Welcome to Engineer Your Success, the podcast that helps you lead with intention and live fulfilled.
Welcome to Engineer Your Success. I am your host, Dr. James Bryant, and your guide to winning at work and at home. If you've ever been promoted because you were excellent at your technical job and suddenly found yourself leading people without much preparation, guess what? This episode is for you. Today, we're going to talk about the pressure facing frontline managers, why so many feel unprepared, and what actually helps them grow faster. My guest today, Ben Perreau, journalist turned product leader, a former leadership strategist and advisor to senior executives at major global organizations, and he's now focused on helping early career managers build leadership capabilities in real time. Ben, welcome to the show.
James, it's so nice to meet you. So nice to spend this time together. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So let's hop right in. You've worked closely with senior executives at major global organizations. So
That's right.
What did you learn about how leadership is developed and supported at that level?
Yeah. You know, when you're working alongside leaders at, let's say, Fortune 100 companies, they have big teams often, lots and lots of people supporting them, working for them, large volumes of direct reports. And the direct reports they tend to have are quite senior because they're usually VPs, SVPs themselves. They usually have a lot of experience in what's required to manage up, because that's something that we all learn through our management career. How do you manage upwards, and how do you do that? So once you get to that level, the actual work of management, the work of leadership becomes much more about making decisions, making choices, and less about making sure you're getting the most out of each individual person who's working for you, because they've already unlocked a lot of their potential. And so it's a job which is very different from the job you're spending earlier in your career when you're trying to become a leader. So people look at leadership at that level at the same standard that they look at leadership at the more junior level. And that's really hard because the people who are working with you, your direct reports when you're early in your career, haven't necessarily learned some of those things yet. And you're still learning them too. So you're just dealing with a slightly different mix in terms of what's going on. So there are some things that are different like that you don't always necessarily recognize. As well as that, folks at the senior level have a lot of resources, not just in terms of their compensation, they're often that too, but they also have access to sometimes 1, 2, 3 individual coaches dedicated to them. Some of them have a thought partner who shadows them around. I remember working with someone from a major hospital chain, and he had somebody who was his chief of staff and somebody who was his advisor, and they'd be in every meeting with him. And so afterwards, we'd get to debrief with him and them, and they would offer different perspectives, and they would also share perspective with him for things he didn't see. So he got the benefit of a co-pilot all the time. So there's a lot of resources there that are available to folks at the senior level, and their expectations are different. But one thing I will say is that everyone worries about the same stuff. How did I come off? How did I come across? My team responding to the way that I'm leading? Are the things that I'm worrying about the right things to worry about? Am I helping everyone understand what good looks like? Am I managing my resources adequately? How do I advocate for more resources? Even the CEO needs to advocate for the right resources from the board. So there's a lot of commonality between very senior leaders and early career managers too.
That's interesting because you talked about the similarities that we're all asking the same questions, but the expectations that you have, when you're at that senior level is that the folks below you have the same quality of people that they're managing, and that's not. So the next question that I have for you is, at what point did you start realizing that the real friction wasn't at the top, or that there was this difference between top line and frontline manager level in terms of preparation and experience and expectation?
Yeah. As a strategy consultant for those kinds of companies, working in the leadership space, I would get access to those folks, and we would spend a lot of time in what I'd call widescreen big meetings, and 15 of the leadership team together in person in the same boardroom, honestly, talking about what needs to happen. And there was a lot of bandwidth for us to have those kinds of conversations, because those were the kinds of conversations that needed to be had. So things that we would consider quite philosophical, that had, multi-billion-dollar impacts in some cases, were conversations that we would talk about with each other, and they would spend hours sometimes talking about one decision that needed to get made. What we realized was then once those decisions needed to get made, then everyone in the organization needed to understand what they were and then also be able to make their own decisions in service of where the strategy for the organization was going. So that would be reflected in the organization's culture or the organization's execution or how they play out. What we realized was it's hard to go and communicate that stuff. Internal communication can only get you so far. It's hard to go and communicate that stuff to people on the front line, but it's also really hard for people on the front line to understand the context within which those decisions have been made. And honestly, it's a different set of challenges when you're a player coach and you're still doing a lot of the playing in the mix as well as the coaching. And so we realized that if you want to drive culture change, which most CEOs who arrive in seat do, I would say, 6 out of 10 CEOs that I meet arrive in the new role and they say, listen, I want to change some things about the organization because this is my leadership. And they need to find a way to be able to activate that around across the rest of the organization. And so then later on, the frontline inherits something that they need to go and change. And they're the ones who are left carrying the change that needs to happen. And they're like, how do I do this? So I think it's an area where people just need more support.
So the leadership comes in, they begin to set a new direction. They want to put their DNA on the culture, and their touch on the culture. And then they communicate that down to the front line managers who then have to perpetuate that at their level to actualize it, right? To actually do it and start performing it and living it. And that becomes kind of a point of contention or breakdown where it may not be happening or they may not have that understanding. So do you think that contributes to those frontline managers or technical professionals feeling like that they're unprepared as they step into like a new management role?
Yeah. I think it's acceptable that most people who go from an individual contributor to stepping into manager are underprepared for the job, right? Often you've spent the entirety of your career becoming wonderful at your discipline. So you spent all of this time getting really, really good at software engineering or developing hardware. Or in my case, as a journalist, I'd become really, I think, pretty decent at writing and understanding what were the right stories to cover in the right moment. Those were great executional things to think about. And so I could write the story, craft the story, do the things I needed to do. But then all of a sudden somebody was like, well, now you're managing 7 people and you have to work with them to do your job. Some people, I think, historically believed that the greatest technicians, and I use the word technician in the broadest sense in any field, make the best managers. But actually, not everyone is called to lead, and not everybody really should take on that job. And I recognize that it's really hard when somebody says, we want to retain you, we want to try and keep you here, and the only way to do that is we pay you more money, and your job has to change by 80%. And you're stuck thinking, so this is the only way I can stay, And in some companies, some companies nowadays they have staff roles, multiple roles. Those are really helpful because they help people find pathways into, more senior roles without having to necessarily manage people if that's not what you feel called to do. But my understanding is that almost everybody, and this is my experience, almost everybody is undersupported in that transition because we haven't fully metabolized the idea that moving from IC to leader is a changing career.
Yeah. And so before we get into how this impacts the companies that you've served and the things that you're doing, you mentioned this. I mentioned it in the intro, and you just mentioned it now.
Yeah.
When you were coming up as a journalist. So let's talk about your transition from journalist to where you are now.
Love to. Yeah. I started my career as a music journalist, of all things. And I was working for a newspaper in the UK called the New Musical Express, which was the first place to write about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Strokes and the Jesus and Mary Chain and Oasis and all these artists that ended up becoming, I guess, global in some way. And so I was very excited to be doing that job, and I was 24. And I'd been a journalist at various other places, Virgin Radio, other places in the UK. But I had never managed anybody. And at the age of 24, it's understandable that I didn't really have the experience. And actually, I thought I'd applied for a job that was slightly more junior, where I thought I was going to go in and get some time to really get good at my job before anything happened. And then a week before I arrived, I realized that I had actually landed the role of running the website. And so that meant a team and change and all sorts of things needed to happen. And I was kind of being brought in for my ideas, but not necessarily for my leadership. But leadership was just part of the job. And so on my first day, they were like, here's your office. I'm 24, worked in 2 offices before this. Here's your office. Here's your assistant. Okay. And then here's the job you need to go and do. I want to know what you think about the cover we're going to put on the magazine, just your opinion, because it wasn't really my decision to decide what was on the cover in an hour. And I was like, oh my goodness, wow, okay, we're going to be making cover decisions in an hour. So, so I was thinking, what am I supposed to do here? So it was the 1970s office block on the South Bank of London. I went into the sort of toilet cubicles and rested my forehead against the door and just broke out in a cold sweat, honestly, because I realized that I was managing a team of 7 people and I had absolutely no clue how to do it. I was a solid writer. I was not a manager. And so all of my work for the next few weeks was about really trying to understand the needs and the moment, honestly, that each of the individual people I was working with was in. But I oscillated wildly between being somebody who was very directional, hyper-directional, which is part of a newsroom trait, honestly, like very, very short conversations, can burn a little bit gladiatorial, or extremely laissez-faire and sit back and, oh, you take care of it. I don't need to be involved in here. And I really only had those 2 leadership styles and didn't have anything in between. And that's not very helpful because people who you're managing are like, how do I work with this person? It's very disorientating to suddenly have to work with somebody who oscillates between these 2 very different leadership styles. So anyway, it took me a while to really bed into what I was doing. Many, many years later, we were able to do a good job with the website. And honestly, in spite of me, not necessarily because of me, that website became the world's biggest music website of its time. I eventually found the leadership development that I needed through feedback. And it wasn't until somebody said, hey, have you ever asked for feedback? This was 3 years later, by the way. Have you ever asked for feedback? I was like, what do you mean? I'm fine. And I think I was just so insecure and overconfident and honestly high on the fumes of our success that I thought everything was fine. I didn't need any feedback. And then from the age of 27 to 35, I got feedback in abundance because I started asking everyone in all directions for feedback. And that was how things started to move.
So what was the impetus for you to start asking? Was it the person asking you if you've ever asked for feedback, or because like your response just now was the person said, hey, have you ever had feedback? And you're like, no, I mean, things are going quite well.
Right. Good question. Yeah. It took me a little while to metabolize the fact that I might be able to improve if I actually was willing to go and ask people for feedback. But I think my pride and insecurity was in the way. And I had to go and overcome that. I also had to realize that, I was in my mid-20s. I had limitations and they were more significant than I was willing to understand or accept at that point. And so I had to go through the process of recognizing what limitations I had. And some of those were coming out in the way that I was unable to be able to drive the change and leadership that I wanted to in the organization. I wasn't able to get the performance I always wanted in the moments I wanted to. There wasn't as much causality between my action and the outcomes. And so I think once I started to realize that, then I recognized I needed to change strategy.
No, I mean, it's beautiful. And so the one thing I'll pull out of your story is that this recognition that something needs to change. And it doesn't mean that it's horrible. It's just a recognition that I'm doing something, the results that I want aren't necessarily lining up with where I want them to be. I may need to change. That is a tremendous amount of introspection in your mid-20s, early 30s to be able to come to that point.
Yeah. And I think sometimes you have to encounter headwinds in order to be able to do that, right? Career headwinds, your career slows down. Maybe it's gone at one speed and it changes speed. Things don't happen quite the way you want them to. Or maybe they're going great, but you realize that you're just not necessarily embodying the kind of leader you want to be. But one way or another, most people will encounter that just by the law of averages at some point in their career. It's just a question of when. And so I was lucky enough to get there at that point.
But in some organizations, they may not have a healthy culture of feedback. It may be a culture of, I'm trying to catch you in something, or I got you.
Let me tell you about media in the UK in the early 2000s. I mean, some industries are incredibly cutthroat, and media in the UK was certainly one of them. And so asking for feedback also can be very loaded, right? You don't know who to ask for feedback. Sometimes you don't know what the agenda is of those stakeholders. Sometimes you don't want to talk to your skip boss because they're busy and you don't want to bother them, and they're the one who has the real wisdom about what's going on in the organization. Maybe you don't want to appear weak in front of your peers or your, what we'd historically call subordinates, your direct reports. So there's a whole spectrum of filtering that you have to do to really understand, like, okay, how should I take that feedback? How is that some person? And these are just more and more of the kind of interpersonal skills that are really hard to go and deploy at work if you've never really had to spend as much time on those things as you have on the technical stuff.
Yeah. And so thank you for taking time to talk about your kind of backstory. Now let's bring this back to kind of the front line managers or early career managers. How, in the work that you've done, how have you seen feedback play in their development?
Yeah. I guess you could say I learned through praxis. I learned through doing and then implementing it. And with frontline managers, in fact, everyone who's leading, when feedback starts to play a role in how you lead, and you're somebody who's being introduced to ideas about how you show up in a conversation, not just in terms of communication skills, but literally your entire leadership, then I see leaders shift. And when you have those feedback conversations and you have them with enough clarity and you recognize that there's kindness and good intent on both sides, then you can start to share things that are true about, that you observe to be true about the way that person shows up. And you see them start to make those changes in real time. And, the wonderful thing about being able to do that is you can then start to see people grow over the course of many weeks and months because they start to become better. And that is a great feeling. I'm sure you've experienced that many times. So when it comes to frontline leaders, it's really about like the leadership part, the management part of their job, more than it is necessarily about the IC, the technical part of their job. And so doing that with them is very rewarding.
What tools have you found useful in helping frontline managers be able to receive feedback so that they can use it as a foundation for accelerating their growth?
Yeah. You can receive feedback in different moments, but actually feedback can occur in different cadences, ranging from once a year to once every hour. And if you're getting a deluge of feedback once a year that comes from your manager, maybe it's come from a 360 review, that's a lot to process emotionally because it's a lot to be said about me, which I find hard. But it's also a lot to unpack in terms of the moments in which I demonstrated those behaviors and the evidence of how that was there. And it's easy to refute some of that feedback. So all the way the other end of the spectrum, we're building a product called Parafoil. Parafoil is designed to give you feedback after every interaction you have with your team. And so you might not want feedback every hour, but you might want to understand what are the patterns in the feedback I'm getting from Parafoil on a day-to-day basis. How am I showing up with this particular direct report over the course of time? So longitudinally, Parafoil watches the way you lead and gives you actionable advice based on the real things you said in your conversations, and then shares with you different ways that you could have said that and different ways that you could have shown up in service of the kind of leader you want to be. So, what's really important is we're not trying to help you become a leader that we think is the right kind of leader for you. Everyone needs to find their own path and be the most authentic version of themselves. We share with you feedback on the basis of some choices you make at the beginning, and then help shape you into the leader that you want to become. And so we do that in the minute to minute, in the hour to hour, in the day to day, rather than waiting until your performance review. And that hopefully means that by the time you get to those quarterly, 6 monthly, biannually reviews, you're already on the path, things are moving. And the goal is to get you to great high performance, be a great kind of leader before you even have to worry about whether or not you're getting feedback from external folks.
The other observations that I have in general is we have to get to the point where we're ready, willing, and able to receive feedback. We get feedback all the time.
Yes.
Just because you get feedback doesn't mean that you're ready to receive it.
It's true. Yeah.
And it's when you're ready to receive feedback, that's when the changes and the growth can happen. Because there's some manager that's listening to this right now. You've been getting feedback for the past few years and you haven't been listening.
Yeah.
And now it's the time to start listening. Not that people are against you or they're trying to say things that can hurt you. How can you take the information that's coming to you and filter it through the lens of
Mhm.
how can I grow and how can this make me better?
Yeah. I- if you're somebody who's completely dedicated to your performance, often that tends to mean a lot of what I call write channel activity and not a lot of read channel activity, right? And so we tend to do a lot of that as somebody who are dedicated to our performance. We tend to be, some of us are very type A. We go and actually one of the hardest behaviors for somebody who is very much like that is to just to kind of build on your point, James, is to step back and say, listen, high performance means high learning. And high learning is something that we've all started to do in software engineering for many, many years. We moved into tight iterative loops, away from waterfall development, a few years ago. Doing that in your own leadership is something that's also really important. And so the more I can encourage people to take a more agile approach to their leadership, I think the more that you will find that you're starting to grow and track up and run the retros you need to be able to be good.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And so, in addition to agile leadership,
Mhm.
what are some other practical takeaways that you would suggest listeners take?
Yeah. I think you have to find your own way to reflect and create space for it. For me, writing and journaling helps me because I have a writerly history. And so it's easy for me to go, oh, I'm going to spend some time doing that. But other people might want to use a chatbot as a journal. That's a way to do it. Other people may want to go and work with a coach, somebody who can help them sort of expose some of the stuff that's important to them. I think you just need to find room and space to reflect. Talk to your friends, and there are lots of different ways to go and process the stuff that you're picking up. And don't be afraid to work out, am I a verbal processor? Am I an internal processor? How am I going to process? What's the best way to do it? I think everyone has their own way. So I would suggest everyone create space for that. I would also say, um, find time and space to make sure you're able to do the things that are important outside of work, because they will help you with all the things that you bring into your leadership at work. And in this world where AI in general is becoming more and more prevalent, is going to do a lot of the, again, small t technical work, a lot of the routing of project work and sort of even writing some of the code for us, all those things, focusing more on how I as a full person can improve things like my judgment, my moral and ethical reasoning, my discernment, my taste. All those things are going to become more important. My creativity, all those things are going to become more important in the future of work, I believe. And so continuing to spend time outside of work to refine and improve on those things and just have a life in which you become the person you want to be, that really helps, I think, in terms of your leadership. So it's all about that whole person, I think, is really important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So, for someone who's listening to this and they want to reach out and connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah. You can you can email our entire team and we all read the emails. Humans at parafoil.co.
I will be sure to include a link to that or that information in the show notes. And so, before we wrap up, I always like to do what I call a mic flip.
Yeah.
And so I've been providing guests to now become the interviewer and I am the interviewee. What's one question that you have for me?
Yeah. I was thinking about this. Is there one thing that you wish you knew or you could have changed about the way that you lead people when you started your career, or like something you could tell yourself at the beginning of your career that you know now? Is there something that's different about the way that you experience or see the world versus then?
Yes. And the first thing that comes to mind is that my way is not the only way, and that my point of view is not the only point of view. Starting in management positions at a fairly young age, not as young as you, not 24, but let's say early 30s,
Yeah.
managing a team of engineers, both in the private sector and the public sector, there's this slight, at least for me, there seemed to be a chip on my shoulder
Mm.
where I have to prove myself is what I'm thinking that I have to prove myself. And one
Yeah.
way I'm thinking that I have to prove myself is this is the way that I see things that need to go. Now I have to really lean on everybody to a point of submission until they follow and do what I say do.
Mm,
It wasn't until years later that I began to learn that different people communicate different ways. They respond to communication and leadership different ways. And it's up to me to understand how I need to package and arrange things to be able to help them do that. And I'll say this, and I've said this a lot. People that have listened to the podcast has probably heard me say this definitely more than once, is that everything I needed to learn about communication in business and in life, I learned in my first 3 years of marriage
mm.
because my wife and I communicated differently. And it took me some time to figure out how I needed to package my communication in a way that she could receive it and then take some action. It doesn't have to be the action that I wanted, but be able to take some action.
I can so relate to that experience. It's such a good choice of experience to bring in here, and it resonates with me. Not least because when you're on this journey with someone for a long time, it can be a marriage or a co-founder relationship, or honestly like a work relationship. But when you know you're on the journey for a long time, you know you have to get it right. And so you put the time in to really see and understand how you show up in the conversation and the way that you do, and to see how you get the opportunity to kind of see how that person is reacting and changing to the way that you show up. And over time, you do learn. And so it's cool that you brought the relationship you have in your marriage into here, because I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
Ben, I really appreciate you taking the time to have this discussion, to be on the show. And I just want you to continue to do great things in the world.
Thank you, James. Likewise, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Hi, this is James, the coach in your corner. Here's something I want you to consider for this week. Early in my career, feedback didn't feel like information. It felt like an attack, not only on my work, but on me. And looking back, that had less to do with the person delivering it and everything to do with where I was in my own confidence and self-awareness at that time. Here's what I had to learn. Feedback is data. It is not a verdict on your worth or value. When feedback lands and your defenses go up, that's your ego doing this job, is trying to protect you. But that same wall that protects you from feeling bad also blocks you from getting better. Great leaders learn to do something different. They separate the feedback from the person delivering it. They set aside the emotional reaction and ask 3 simple questions. Is there data to support this? What can I learn from it? And what, if anything, should I change? You don't have to agree with every piece of feedback that you receive. Leaders who grow the fastest in their ability to win at work and at home are the ones who learn how to leverage feedback as fuel for success. So here's your challenge this week. The next time feedback comes your way, solicited or not, resist the urge to get defensive. Treat it like the data point that it is. Listen, learn, and decide how to apply. This is the coach in your corner, and I want you to be great this week.